Asia and Africa has been most important determining factor of Indian-US relationship. India-US relationship in the early phase started with the positive note. In the order to have a clear understanding of this relationship, one can see divided into two phases: Cold War phase 1947 to 1991 and post-Cold War phase 1991 onwards. Cold War phase 1947 to 1991, the Indo-US relations have been best described as one of the roller coaster at times. It has been punctuated by brief intervals of warmth and friendly gestures as well. To illustrate, both India and the United States were on the same side on the Suez Canal issue in 1956, again in the 1959 when President Eisenhower visited India, he was given a tumultuous welcome and the President on the part observed the stand of India is our interest. Similarly, in India, October 1962, when China invaded India, America along with Britain come to support India and thereby saved her from a military disaster. Indo-US relations became very cordial during the John F. Kennedy period. His successor, President Lincoln Johnson also kept the cordiality intact by establishing the Tarapur atomic plant stations and by supplying a large quantity of food grains to enable India to fight over the acute shortage caused by the draft in 1966 to 7. Again in 1973, as a friendly gesture, the US brought of the largest amount of foreign debt ever cancelled in history by dividing two-thirds of its accumulated rupee holdings in India acquired in return for wheat supplements under PL 480. It was a case of rare magnanimity of the part of Washington. Again in 1978, President Jimmy Carter paid a goodwill visit to India to register and restore American sympathy and empty for India. Its economic aid, suspended since the Bangladesh crisis, has resumed, and the US administration agreed to resume supply of the nuclear fuel for the TAPS, while with was cut due to Indian peaceful nuclear explosion at Cochrane in 1974. Clearly, Carter was predisposed to look to India as the leader of South Asia, but unfortunately, these brief intervals of warmth were soon followed by bouts of bitterness and disillusionment for the reason or another. All, Although the two countries were never in the direct confrontations, but their world vision and approach for future world was totally different. Cold War phase has been considered to be the phase of back and forth diplomacy. A number of factors were responsible for this negative phase of relationship, like India's role is the foundation of NAM and its achieving propagations of non-alignment in international forums and as a base principle of its foreign policy. Socialist planning of Indian economy through five-year 5-year plans by socialist leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, recognition of Communist China by India in December 1949, Pakistan's closeness to US. Next point is the Korean crisis and Indian refusal to endorse the US-sponsored uniting for peace resolution. Now, next point is United States stand on Jammu Kashmir in the United Nations Security Council. India's closeness to USSR and the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation of 1971. And next point is India's nuclear program as its refusal to sign the international non-proliferation treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty post India's peaceful nuclear explosion explosion at Pokhran in 1974. The US refusal to supply nuclear fuel to Tarapur Atomic Power Station, refusal of India to sign NPT, and US intent on enforcement of missile technology control regime against India, which further added to bitterness. Bilateral relations suffered a setback in 1979 due to Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. India refused to rally behind the US and refused to describe Soviet Union as an aggressor. Next point is India is also critical about US supplies of arms sales to Pakistan. And last one, not least, during the tenure of Ronald Reagan, bitterness increased due to differences over Diogo Garcia in Indian Ocean, and India wanted dismantling of US based in Diogo Garcia. India's demanding establishment of Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. The bone of contention between Indo and US relations was the American hostility towards communism and the dangers of its spread in South Asia, as well as heavily favoring Americans' Pak-oriented Indian subcontinent and Central Asian policies. Under Baghdad Pact, US considers Pakistan, Iran, and Iraq as the frontline states against Soviet expansionism towards the vast borders of the Indian Oceans. These points alienated the positions of the two countries in the policy-making circles of each others and created a sense of mistrust and suspicion which remains up to the end of the Cold War. Now moving on to post-Cold War phase 1991 to immediate years. Indo-US relations have made significant strides in the post-Cold War era, leaving the infamous tag of interrelated democracies behind. In fact, the two countries have premised their strong bonds upon the strength of their traditions as the oldest and largest democracy in the world. As governance structures, education, awareness, and the governments themselves have evolved in the both countries, there is even more that has been under the ambit of common values shared between the US and India. These shifts have also coincided with changing contours of the international order to since the end of the Cold War. This marks one of the most important changes concerning US-India-US relation on that seeks to balance shifting global power centers with a stable works order essentially determined by a new balance of power. As Asia transitions into the stronger content, there is a new power scramble that seeks to append the world's traditional understanding of state alliance and partnerships. In 1990 to 1991, the collapse of Soviet Union, the end of Cold War, and the economic liberalizations of India, the two countries looked afresh and their bilateral relations during Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's tenure. Therefore, despite several irritants, both sides tried to move forward with their bilateral relations. Two countries had joint naval exercise in May 1992. Prime Minister Rao paid an official week-long visit to the US in May 1994, which had to strengthen ties and was followed by a signing of several memoranda of understanding. In 1995, following the India's visit by the US Defense and Commerce Secretaries, several agreements were signed. However, US trade laws still affected India's export, which again was a disturbing factor in India-US relations. Relations show setback regarding the sale of F-16 aircraft to Pakistan. Once again, supply of nuclear fuels to Tarapur reactors suffered. Sales of cryogenic engines were hit with created discomfort between the two, and US refused to sell supercomputers to India. Need for better forecasting of weather so necessary for the agriculture's defense economy. India suspended by devising one of the its own which made us realize India's growing technology powers. Now, modest beginning in defense ties, the security and defense perceptions of India and the United States during the entire Cold War period was too divergent and conflicting that they could not collaborate on security and defense issues. This was hardly any significant economic cooperation and political convergence between India and the US or various international issues that could enable them to enter into the strategic and defense cooperation. Despite the differences, some initiatives were taken during the Cold War years too. The US strategy saw India as the pivotal state of the region and Pakistan as a useful place to base long-range US bombers as well as the potential ally to the best of US interest in the tense Persian Gulf region. Also, the US administration took a strong interest in India in the 1950s and 1960s with the hope that New Delhi could emerge as a credible balancer to Communist China. This was the period of the greatest US involvement and interest in South Asia. India's US defense relations date back to the 1950s when the two countries engaged in joint exercise along with the British and Australians. The US approved the sale of 200 Sherman tanks with millions S-55 helicopters and 54 C-119 Fairchild military transport aircraft for India Air Force. These was not in the use in the US and were not of the combating system of the US force structure groups weapons. Overall, India's defense from the United States during the early years was extremely limited. The defense equipment was of indifference quickly as the US was not forthcoming in giving the kind of weapon that India requires. During the Sino-Indian War in 1962, the US provided military supplies to India. This assistance came in the forms of small arms, ammunitions, and communications this, for mountaining warfare in a short reconciliation period. After the Sino-Indian Border War in 1962, the US gave economic assistance for fiscal years 1961 to 62 and 1962-1963 exercise of 2 billion to blunt the communist influence in South Asia. During the Cold War in the 1980s, a chance into Indo-US defense cooperation was visible in the wake of Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The United Nations offers to share Americans' military hardware to India as well as the India's team, which is to the United States in 1980. To explore the possibility of buying TOV tank missiles and long-range orbiters, the Carter administration has reversed its earlier policy of disapproving the use of an advanced American electronic guidance system in India, Jaguar aircraft, and in the nuclear field. It's permitted to more enriched uranium fuel shipments to Tarapur. Now, the nuclear relations. In March 2000, India agreed to allow close international monitoring of its nuclear program while refusing to give up its current nuclear arsenal. In 2002, negotiation for Deal 123 agreement was conducted which allowed waivers to allow peaceful nuclear activities in India. The US Indo-US nuclear deal signed on 18th July 2005 now as the Henry J. Hyde United States Indian Peaceful Atomic Cooperation Act 2006, aimed at meeting India's energy requirements, has almost put an end to the nuclear confrontations between India and the US. The legislation allowed India to use its purchase of US nuclear materials and reactors. It was expected to lead to dismantling of the technological denialism that constrains Indo-US cooperation and commerce in defense technology. The US deal strengthened the Indo-US ties as they expanded the scope of the next step in strategic partnership and high technological cooperation group and opens up adventures for India regarding to dual use technology with United States. After NSG waivers in September 2008, other countries like France and Russia have signed separate agreements for full nuclear cooperation with India. Further, the signing of the civil nuclear deal, it's promoted qualitative and quantitative upgrade, upgradations in the defense cooperation. In March 2009, the US provided sale of P-8 Poseidon's military aircraft to India's worth $2.1 billion, which was considered as largest military ties between the two countries. Mainly India's observers terms the deal and marking the country's return to the non-proliferation mainstreams, even as some sections alleged a compromise of national interest by submitting a self-reliance program to international scrutiny. On the other hand, critical across the global questions the privileged treatment to one country by transcending the NPT framework, which they felt could weaken the treaty. Indo-US nuclear deal was approved by the US Congress into law, now called the US States India Nuclear Cooperation Approved and Non-Proliferation Enhancement Act on 8 October 2008 and was signed by India and US on 10 October 2008. The promise of participation in global nuclear trades facilitated by the September 2008 India-specific waivers from the guidelines of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, basically name is NSG. Entitled these major outcomes for India, number one is uninterrupted flow of uranium for its reactors, introductions of advanced reactor technologies to expand its nuclear energy program, the strategic spin of a gaining a seat at the high tables of the non-proliferation region. The deal was also part of a broader curtains of India curtains of India by the US to help fight global terrorism and counter China's rising influence in Asia. The US also was hoping for greater alignment on other strategic issues such as how to deal with a nuclear arms Iran and a country that has long enjoyed friendly ties with India. Now, Narendra Modi takes over. When Narendra Modi takes over as a prime minister in 2014, Barack Obama had been the president of US for almost 6 years. His perceptions of India was saved largely by his judgment that India, unlike Pakistan next door, was thankful not a problem. India instead represented a great opportunity for US and in large measure due to his interactions with Modi's predecessors. Manmohan Singh at the height of the global financial crisis could be a potential asset for Washington DC as Obama restructured as the characters of US global engagement in the aftermath of the exercise of the Bush era. Unfortunately for Obama and the US, the second UPA terms in office was completely unlike the first one, and the hope of a dependent bilateral partnership quickly ran dry to the present considerations at exactly the time when most American policymakers were expecting a blossoming in the strategic partnership. Narendra Modi's political instincts allowed him to quickly appreciate the extent to which US-India relations had fallen around the time he took office. Despite his limited experience with Washington up to that point, he understood that the pervasive frustration in both capitals did not bode well for their larger project of revitalizing India, balancing the threats posed by growing China's power and expanding New Delhi influence on the international stage. In the manner unlike his recent predecessors, Modi invested heavily in building a personal relationship with the peers aboard, whether his American counterparts, first Obama and now Trump, guided by the logic that even if US and Indian national interests did not always cohere, the latter would always come out ahead of its individual string policy in Washington were favorable disposed towards India. Modi personalized the conduct of Indian international relations in ways not seen in decades to the advance of Indian states as a whole. His American counterparts, first Obama and now Trump, guided by the logic that even if US and India national interests did not always cohere, the latter would always come out ahead if the nationalist trading policy in Washington were favorable despite towards India. Modi personalized the conduct of Indian international relations in ways not in the decades to the advance of Indian interest to evolve. Now this unit is completed, not all completed. We will discuss about in next class. Till now, you can lead and listen this unit and unit number 4 and write some notes in your notebook. Thank you so much. We will meet again in next class. Namaste.